needs of people, plants, and animals. And just to give you an aside, while we were making this option, I also did not think about it in that way. Uh, so there are three options: 10 years in the future, 50 years in the future, 100 years in the future. So as previously, we want to keep views on this, probably 30 more seconds, and then I'll close this. Yeah, thank you so much. Now I'll close this. I think last responses are coming up, so I'm just waiting. Yes, thanks a lot. I close this, end this poll, and share the result. And mostly people believe that 10 years and 50 years, so it is an immediate crisis, whereas I just removed an option which was currently. So I think that should be the immediate one. I stop sharing this one and go to the last poll. And here also I need your quick responses. How concerned are you about water scarcity in your area in the next 10 years? Extremely, very concerned, moderately, slightly, and not at all. Good to see that nobody is going for not at all option. I can see that the way responses are coming in. So as previously, this will be up for 30 more seconds. Thank you so much. Last couple of responses, and then I close this. Those who have joined just now, I request you to. Yes, thanks a lot. And I share the result. And finally, we have somebody who says not at all concerned. Otherwise, people are very concerned and moderately and extremely. So we can see the trend. So thanks a lot. This is a very good insight. Very good insight for the guest and for all of us to understand. So I'm Sudhir Pandey. I welcome you to Ahmedabad University. We are a research non-profit university, and we believe in discussing ideas which are very relevant for all of us. And we also believe that classrooms should be able to do very few things. And in that attempt, we invite deep scholars and thinkers from different areas to discuss topics with our student and otherwise with public at large. In that process, today we have Dr. Giulio Boccaletti, and I have been a huge fan. I have been following him for the most than 1 year, and he's written a fabulous book. And somehow we were able to got him for the conversation series. Just to give a quick introduction, Dr. Giulio Boccaletti is an author, entrepreneur, and senior executive with experience in both the private and non-profit sectors. A strong communicator and public speaker. He's an internationally recognized expert on natural resource security. For the last 2 decades, he has worked on strategy, sustainable economic development, and conservation issues across a dozen of countries. He started his career as a climate scientist at Princeton University and MIT, was a partner of the global consultancy McKinsey and Company, where he was a leader of its sustainability and resource productivity practice, and was the chief strategy officer of the Nature Conservancy, one of the largest conservation organizations in the world. He has published and a very good book that you that you would have seen, Water, a Biography. And he's also contributed to the development of several documentaries and PBS. He's also the co-founder of Chloris Geospatial, a venture backed by company dedicated to measuring nature's contribution to the global economy. And in fact, his book was considered top 10 books by The Economics in 2021. So we are extremely delighted and honored to have you, Dr. Giulio, at the Ahmedabad University.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot. And the person who will be in conversation with Dr. Giulio is our Professor Saptam Patel from Amrit Modi School of Management. Most of you also know she also teaches a foundation program on water, and her area of research actually intersect water, community, gender, and fine arts. So we are happy to have Professor Saptam Patel to be in conversation with Dr. Giulio. Before I hand it over to you, there are certain rules and things that we need to observe. So during the conversation for the next 60 minutes, except both the speakers, everybody will be muted. And I would request that all the participants, if you have any question, you can put in the everybody chat box, and we'll curate those questions and we'll come back to you around 5 p.m., 5 p.m. and all the questions will be addressed. So thank you so much. And I request Professor Saptam Patel to take it forward.
Thank you so much, Sudhir.
Good evening, all of you, and a very, very hearty welcome to you, Julio, to the conversation series. I am super excited and really looking forward to this session for multiple reasons. And first being the fact that you're here, and I have known you as an incredible expert in your field, and so I'm sure the coming 1.5 hours is going to be a kind of treat to all of us. Another is, of course, as we know that in the recent times, the urgency and relevancy around water has grown. And making this subject and making, water issues around water matter of great significance. And we all know how 97% of the water that covers the Earth's surface is kind of not won't be used because it's salty and it is kind of trapped in sea. And the remaining 3% also 2.5% is again trapped where we can't get it either as underwater. It's kind of underground water or in glaciers. And so what remains with us, as some of the people say, that if it's a bathtub full of water, it's about 1 teaspoon that we have for our use, fresh water for our use, and that has remained. I read it in your book. For the so many billions of years, this has remained the same. However, we never know what we see in the coming future. And so all of this makes talking about water a discourse, an intellectual discourse like this on water, an extremely important one. But before I kind of, embark on my list of questions, I would like to inform you, Julio, and our audience, how at Ahmedabad University water has always been so close. So all our students entering the Ahmedabad University, they go through a very unique program called Foundation Program. And this program actually offers an interdisciplinary and experiential learning experience, which remains at the heart of Ahmedabad University's educational philosophy. And during the foundation program, the students actually go through project-based learning, and they study 6 different domains of learning. And these domains of learning actually are categorized into 3 areas. 2 are skills like communication and data. 2 are areas of advanced research and innovation that are transforming the world today, that is biology and life and materials. And 2 areas where we do some perspective building for students, that is behavior and constitution and civilization. And being a part of Water Studio since February 2018, this is when we designed Water Studio with the help of some experts, water experts within Ahmedabad University and even outside Ahmedabad University. And teaching Water Studio for like so many years, I have realized that, however hard we try, we will have one particular type of perspective, that is academics perspective. And so if we want our students to understand water from a little broader perspective, we need people who are kind of working on water solutions, studying water from different perspectives like you. And here you are, helping us and a lot of people who have joined this session today. So as I can see in your background, the book, and the title of your book is really fascinating when you say Water, a Biography. And more than title, the cover itself is also very, very fascinating. And your book has seen an incredible amount of appreciation from across the globe. And, I have written down some words, and they are very impressive, magisterial, prodigious, brilliant, and enlightening, fascinating, encyclopedic, impressively global in scope, an essential read, and whatnot. So not just that the book or the title is fascinating. I've read your book, and it's extremely fascinating. It's a brilliant biography, and the multiple perspectives through which you have studied water. Someone definitely may mistake you as a historian. Someone may, kind of call you a political scientist, someone an archaeologist and an environmentalist and all that. However, this multidimensional perspective that clearly is evident from the book suggests that you have had, an extensive reading and study about water for years and years and years, because it doesn't come, from an overnight study. But can you please share with us how you were inspired to write about water, not just from your area of discipline, but from so many different perspectives? I'm sure it was not easy, but and I think water is something. I mean, because we're doing this foundation program in studio, water is something that cannot be studied as a standalone, uh, um, um, area or an element. It is inextricably connected with so many things which is there in your book. So tell us, how did you build this? And I won't call it, historical. I would definitely call it a political interdisciplinary narrative.
Well, yes. So thank you. And first of all, thank you to obviously Ahmedabad University for inviting me, and to you, Saptam, and to Sudhir for both your kind words and for inviting me and wanting to spend some time with me. I really appreciate it. And particularly, I think the context that you just set up and the program and the studio that you're running suggests that this is the right forum to have this conversation, because you ask why I wrote this and why is it called a biography, and kind of how did the idea come from. And as you note, I started life as a climate scientist, and then I, at some point about 10 years after I entered academia, I decided, as many young academics sometimes do, that I wanted to encounter the real world. And so I left academia and I started working first at McKinsey and where, and then at the Nature Conservancy. So for about 15, almost 20 years, I worked in the so-called real world. And going into this experience, I thought, well, water is simply the expression of the climate system on the planet. Water is the agent of the climate system. It's the way in which the climate system expresses itself. When I first started working, in the early 2000s on these issues, climate and climate change wasn't a particularly fashionable topic. But the moment I framed issues of climate in water terms, everybody sort of lit up, and I started being able to talk to companies and governments about these issues. And so for the subsequent several years, I found myself talking to a number of governments, including actually in India, both at the Planning Commission and in the government of, say, Karnataka, for example, on kind of water issues. And as I did that, I sort of entered the conversation thinking that we would end up having a very sort of disciplinary conversation about solutions, about engineering solutions or maybe economic solutions, and a sort of very somewhat simplistic planning perspective that said, okay, well, let's define quantitatively the problem and let's line up all the solutions and then figure out how we implement them and what the costs and benefits are, etc., etc. But the more I did this and the more I traveled around the world, I worked a lot in aside from India, in Ethiopia, in Jordan, in Mexico, a lot in Europe, in America. It became very clear something that you mentioned earlier, which is that water is also very personal and very cultural and very deeply embedded in both identity of the individual and identity of the nation. And that it was, very quickly conversations that started as technical and engineering conversations would sort of drift into deeply political conversations about, what should our home look like? Because at the end of the day, that's the central question of managing water on the landscape, because water transforms so much of what's around us. In the end, the question we're really asking is, what does home look like and who gets to decide, right? Those are kind of the two central questions. They're deeply political questions. And so this was a profound experience for me, because I realized the limitations of disciplinary approaches to this problem, because you can be an engineer or you can be an economist, but you're never really going to wrap your hands around the root causes of some of the water issues if you don't engage with this broader political narrative and how it's constructed and who dominates it and so forth, so on. And so, I decided to write the book, and this has been a long gestation, and you can imagine, I started writing it started thinking about writing in 2015, and it eventually came out in 2021. So it was a 6-year project, if you will. And the question I was trying to answer is, well, how would I write something that will reveal this underlying political DNA? How will I reveal to people that this shouldn't be read as a book about problems and solutions, positivist sort of framing of an imminent problem, although imminent it is. How do I reveal the sort of genetic material with which this thing is built, which is deeply political, historical, cultural, as well as scientific and engineering and economic and the likes. And it seemed to me that I had to write a story, not a history specifically, because this, as you will have noticed, is not a book of historiography, right? I mean, I'm writing a story with a purpose to illuminate the present. Good history is not about teaching us lessons, it's about revealing the past. Here I'm using the past to reveal something about where we are. And so it's not properly just a history book, but it is a history of ideas in a way, in the sort of Isaiah Berlin tradition. And so I decided that would be the right way to do it. It's kind of trying to tell a story about our relationship with this substance. And the subtitle biography, which is a little cheeky because there's all sorts of problems, obviously, that come with anthropomorphizing this issue, but is a way of revealing that this is dialectic relationship, right? Not dialectic in a sort of Hegelian sense of dialectic, but dialectic in the more mundane sense of we live in a landscape that's transformed by a powerful agent, water, as the expression of the climate system. And we have to exercise collective agency in order to respond to that agency of water. And in the process, in that dialectic, in that dialogue between us and water, our home and ourselves are transformed. And so the traces of that transformation are in the institutions that are all around us. And one of the things I wanted to reveal was that those traces run quite deep. So they end up being part also of pretty abstract ideas and institutions that go from culture to things like democracy and institutions and so forth, so on. So that's the motivation. And maybe the last thing I'll say, Saptam, and you can tell I can drone on, so feel free to interrupt me at any point here. But the other thing I should say is why now? So I wrote this book as a reflection of an experience, and I think that why now? It's because, as I write at one point in the book, we live in a very unusual time when the sort of promise of modernism was emancipation from nature, was a complete separation from our environment and our home as it's defined by the forces of this planet. And for the last 100 years, we spent billions and billions of dollars or rupees to build infrastructure that would essentially sever our connection with the variability that is the agency of water, right? And we were pretty successful to the point that, certainly where I live in London, nobody has any clue about the power of water in the landscape. It's just a piece of scenery. It's just the background, right? Now, in a country like India, it depends on where you are. Some people in India will have that experience. Others in India have a very, very strong felt experience of what it means to live in a landscape dominated by water. But many, many people, and especially people of power, have sort of forgotten why we're so connected. And they've done so because we have successfully created institutions and infrastructure that have exercised some degree of control over the landscape. But as I said at the beginning, the water is just a symptom of the climate system. It's just an expression of it. It's an agent of it. And the climate system is changing. And as it changes, it exceeds the boundaries and the structures that we've put in place to control it. And so it's reappearing in our life, right? As we've seen tragically in Pakistan just recently, as we've seen in Europe over the course of the summer, as we keep seeing in the Western United States and in India, it's sort of a universal phenomenon, the Yangtze in China. And so this is an important time to think about what we do. And, I'm a scientist by training, but I do not think the answer is follow the scientists, right? I think that the problem here is as the initial survey suggested, government and citizens, the relationship between us as individuals and us as collective agents, that's where the secret to managing and living with this force resides. And so that's why, I decided to write this book now, and that's why it's called a biography.
Yeah, I absolutely. I would like to, just read out what another water expert on water management, is from Georgetown University, Mark Giordano. And he actually said that, almost always the drinking water problem has nothing to do with physical water scarcity. It has to do with scarcity of financial and political wherewithal to put in the infrastructure to get people clean water. I mean, they're two separate things. And then I would like to read from what you have written. You're saying that the story is familiar, it is also wrong. The story of water is not technological, but political. And the impact of water on society must be read through the scars left by a continuous cycle of adaptation. All communities relate to water over time through a process of action and reaction. A levee might kind of protect people settled behind it. A dam might store water for those times when none comes from the sky. But as towns grow and farms expand, people forget why those structures were built in the first place. And society evolves and habituates to the newfound security. Institutions develop in the shadow of infrastructure designed to create an illusion of stability. And then one day, unexpectedly, the levee kind of fails, or the reservoir behind the dam goes dry. Loss follows, sometimes catastrophically, and people are forced to reconsider their environment, which no longer the inert scenery is no longer an inert scenery to their life, and they learn, rebuild, expand, reaching a new level of security. Their institutions adjust, habit changes, and the cycle repeats. So. Yeah. It's very much like what you're saying is that we may kind of, sometimes remain in an illusion, that it's all technological and it has to do with one discipline. However, it's very much political, and it kind of, has to do with the will. And as in our first poll, people said that it's government and individuals, and at both these places, it has to do with will to kind of do something, even if at all, you want to address water scarcity. How, I mean, and you mentioned about the scars, which have been left, by water. So tell us something, from your broad, deeper study that you have kind of put in the book. What are these scars? And if you want to talk about a few of them, about the technological, let's say, innovations, probably, in the beginning of the 20th century to now. I mean, if you want to kind of share with us some of the stories and the scars by water.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that, those scars are, first of all, you talk about will. I mean, without invoking Rousseau, and it's not general will, but it's still, a collective action. And it's a collective action of sovereignty, right? Because a lot of what we do with water is about the landscape. And it's about modifying and transforming the landscape around us. And so, interestingly, these scars last a long, long time. And so, even before you get to the technology of the 20th century, you have the cultural scars of this relationship. We the human species, Homo sapiens, has been on the planet as the dominant hominid for maybe 300,000 years, so 2 ice age cycles. And for most of that time, as far as we can tell, we were mostly nomadic and mostly hunter-gatherers. And then after the last glaciation about 20,000 years ago, as the ice was sort of melting away and transforming the landscape around us, we became sedentary, right, about 10,000 years ago. Well, not all of us, and one shouldn't overstate the case. I mean, people will remember the Mongols and the Huns, and all these people were nomads for a long time, and we had nomadic and stateless societies all the way up to the 19th century. So you don't want to sort of overstate the point, but nevertheless, a large number of people became sedentary, and ultimately sedentary societies overpopulated everybody else. And those first sedentary societies, and we're now talking about 8,000 BC, right? So 6,000 years before the Vedas, to be kind of clear. They left us stories. I'm reminded, and I used to work in America a lot, and there's there's a story that's in the oral tradition of the Klamath tribe, which is a Native American tribe from the western side of the United States, from Oregon. And they are settled in Oregon near a place called Crater Lake. And they have this story of how Crater Lake was formed. And it's a story that's been told over and over and over again, and it's still told today. And the story of this god that's from the netherworld, from the underworld, shows up and is infatuated with the daughter of the chieftain of the tribe, and she refuses his advances, and so the chief invokes the help of the god of the heavens, and the two gods fight. There's fire, and the sky darkens, and eventually the god of the heavens prevails over the god of the underworld and pushes him back down and collapses the top of the mountain on top of him, and then fills the top of the mountain with water, and to achieve tranquility, right? And that's the end of that story. And that story has reached us. Now, we know from geological evidence when that lake formed, and in fact it formed out of a rather catastrophic volcanic explosion roughly 7,000 years before Common Era, and we know from archaeological evidence that the Klamath tribe was there 7,000 years ago. So this myth that gets told and that has reached us is in fact the record of a real event, right? The event that happened 7,000 years before Common Era. And so that's just to say that culture is probably where the scars last the longest, because stories and narratives and pictures have this property. I used to be a scientist. If I write a scientific paper, 30 years from now, nobody will read it. But if you tell a story that's compelling, it can last for generations. It can last for thousands and thousands of years, and so the first scars are those, right? And then, in the book, I go through multiple iterations. Obviously, you can imagine that there are enormous scars in the architecture of our religious culture, from the Abrahamic religions that emerge in the Levant to the Vedas themselves, Rig Veda, Varuna, the god of water and oceans, which then becomes Prapirun in Thailand, and spreads all the way to Japan. Those are those are the scars, the cultural scars that are still with us today. But you can find the same scars in democracy. We can, I can tell you that story if you want, or the sort of the architecture of the modern state, which is a accretion of experiences that have been developed by societies that had as their principal problem to deal with water. Because of course, until the 19th century, until the end of the 19th century, most societies, all societies, were agricultural societies. And so water as the principal ingredient of agriculture becomes a dominant concern, right? And then you get to the 20th century. We can go back to the past if you want, but just to get to the 20th century, what happens in the 20th century is something quite remarkable, because with the benefit of hindsight, you could say that up to 1900, our principal form of management for water on the landscape was institutional, in truth. So it was mostly about exercising power over people and exercising that power so that you could organize labor and, in part transform the landscape. But frankly, also, like the Egyptians managed water. They mostly left the Nile alone and mostly managed water indirectly by managing grains and stocking them when they could, and so forth, so on, right? Then comes the 20th century, concrete, the modern state, and the political emancipation of people, right? Many, many more people make many, many more claims on a state that's ever more greater. We live now in a world in which the state represents, 30, 40% of the economy. That wasn't the case up until the 1900s, right? And so what happens is that we suddenly in the 20th century start pouring concrete and cement all over the place. And in a matter of less than a century, in 1904, the biggest dam in the world was the Lower Aswan Dam on the Nile, which was a brick dam, a masonry dam that the Brits built when the protectorate was in place in Egypt. By the time you get to, at that point in 1904, humanity caught almost nothing of what came down from the sky. Literally, we had almost no storage capacity. Fast forward to 1970, after Nehru announces the Great Cathedral of India and so forth, so on, you get to capturing about a fifth of everything that comes down from the sky. Over the course of less than a century, we transformed the hydrology of the planet in hydraulics of the industrial economy. right? And we did that by transforming the landscape, levees, dams, canals, the multi-purpose dam. In many ways, it was an extraordinary transformation that benefited an enormous number of people, but also transformed our landscape, our ecosystems, and critically created this vast illusion, which is now breaking. We've had a couple of generations of people who have grown up, many of them believing that nature is other, it's out there. And now we suddenly discover it's at our doorstep, and we have to decide what to do. And the risk is that we say, well, we'll just call up an engineer, forgetting that for the last 8,000 years, the discussion wasn't about engineering. That's a product. And the real discussion is who gets to decide, and what does it look like when you decide, and so that's, that gives you a little bit of sense of the scars. The scars are all these layers of institutional infrastructure that start 10,000 years ago when we became sedentary and have yet to end. We're still building today at great pace.
Quite interesting. But you mentioning Varun as the rain god. I mean, water is worshipped in India, and here the rivers are goddesses. In fact, all of them, and we have this rain god. Okay, so and water in Indian mythology, water has many stories where it's seen as primordial, spiritual symbol, a heavenly body descended for the human redemption. And when you talk about, water and your anthropomorphizing water, calling it a special character, and everything around in your book revolves around water. And of course, you clearly mentioning how water, this shapeless substance, is shaping everything around it, activities, societies, and all of it. In fact, you're saying that it has been a very powerful climate agent, affecting climate. So not only the culture and the societies, but also climate. And you have also mentioned that it's such a powerful, agent that all the other processes around it kind of get dwarfed by the very magnitude of the process in which it gets involved itself. So these two things, if you want to kind of, tell us how, number one, water is something which kind of dwarfs everything around it, being a very powerful agent, including, affecting like how water in the water vapor, is kind of, it has been protecting society our planet for years and years and years. Two, water as somebody affecting how I perform my daily routine, okay? Using water as a part of my everyday ritual, using it as a part of my prayers. So if you want to kind of combine the two and maybe tell us.
Well, and I suppose that part of the reason I'm doing that is because, in much of the water discussions, I've been living water debates forever now, and there is one issue, and you started yourself talking about this when you pointed out rightly that the water that we experience, that we have available to us as a human society is a tiny fraction of what's on the planet. It's a teaspoon to the bathtub, as you said, right? And so then the risk is that we get stuck, and because this discussion about water happens in a historical moment where we consider ourselves mostly consumers rather than citizens. We tend to interpret our relationship with the environment in terms of consumption and in terms of kind of our individual actions of consumption, right? There's this kind of dominant narrative of water as this fragile, scarce resource that might disappear, and therefore we have to sort of be careful and nurture it. And of course, there's truth to that. The other quote you mentioned from the other fellow from I think Georgetown is absolutely right. The issue of drinking water is an issue of power. It's not an issue of scarcity, right? There's always going to be drinking water for the rich. It's always a question of whether you can extend and mutualize the costs to cover everybody. But that's not the real crux of the relationship with water. The relationship with water is our relationship with water on the landscape, agriculture and managing floods and kind of the big water, if you will. And there, this metaphor of the kind of fragile, scarce substance fails us, because in fact, water on the landscape is responsible for incredible power. And now in India, it's easier to understand because your climate is dominated by the monsoon, which is a very sort of physical representation of that power. The monsoon is a tropical cyclone. Effectively, it's the equivalent of the Hadley cell. It's a massive convective system that operates as a thermal engine, right? So it's fueled by convection and by the evaporation of water brought in from the Arab Sea and from the Indian Ocean, and that water evaporates up into the atmosphere, goes over India, which is hot, and then it rises and precipitates out, and in doing so releases enormous amounts of energy. So it's a heat engine, right, that's powered by the heat of the surface. If you were to calculate how much energy is involved in maintaining the monsoon over the course of its summer life cycle, the first monsoon, you would discover that that single phenomenon is 10 times the world economy, right? So all the energy that we use to power industries, to heat our homes, to travel the world, to all the coal we burn, all the oil we burn, all the wind we harness, all the hydropower we harness, all of that stuff, everything is a tenth of what a single monsoon does, right? And that monsoon is, roughly 100th, so 1% of the energy involved in moving water around in the atmosphere. And so in an energetic sense, now one has to be careful because not all of that energy we experience, not all of that energy gets transferred into winds and work, right? But nevertheless, it gives you a sense of scale, right? And so it's important to recognize this because otherwise there's the risk that this becomes people end up thinking that this is just an issue of neglect. Oh, we're just not paying enough attention. If we just paid enough attention and put a bit of resources, we can manage it. Right? But the fact of the matter is that we're dealing with a force that's overwhelming. And it's overwhelming in different ways in different places, and it moves around, and some countries are more exposed than others. The monsoon is far more powerful than the mid-latitude cyclones that hit Europe. But because all of our economies and societies are finely tuned to deal with their particular climate reality, small changes in the behavior of this massive giant can make huge differences to our life, right? And so in a way, it's really important that people recognize this. Now, this then couples with a long-standing tradition, which I would argue is the dominant human interpretation of water, which is as a giant, as a transformative force. And you can see that, as I was saying earlier, and as you just mentioned, in our cultural traces, right? I mean, one of the things, we become sedentary, as I said, about 8,000 BC. That's, probably in the Levant. Sedentism in Asia happens a little later, but, somewhere around 8,000 before Common Era to say 5,000 before Common Era, most continents other than North America have completely sedentary societies established. And that is also the time from which many, many myths come of overwhelming power of water. The great rivers of China are described in countless myths of the gods trapping great dragons in mountains that then get released down, and they turn into rivers, and they become the Pearl, the Yangtze, the Amur River, and all the great Himalayan rivers that feed agriculture for today 3 billion people, right? Or you go to even North America, there's the Lenape tribe that used to inhabit Manhattan, they called it Mannahatta, that's where the name comes from. They believed to be the descendants of insect people that had survived a great flood. You go to the South America, there's a famous Unu Pachacuti flood, which is the great flood in the Inca tradition that covered Peru. And 2 brothers survived by hiding on the top of a mountain. And then you go to Europe and you have a story of Zeus flooding. And then you have a story of Bergelmir, the Norse god, who survived a great flood by building a boat and floating away with his wife. Well, then you go to maybe the oldest known piece of literature that we have, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Atrahasis, which is another Mesopotamic epic, which it's been written down probably around the same time as the Vedas, but probably dates to an oral tradition that goes back to maybe 2,000-3,000 years before that, where that talks about, again, an ancient man that builds a boat and puts all the animals on it and then survives a great flood. And that, of course, is also the origin of the story of Noah and the ark that's dominant in the Abrahamic tradition, right? So all these stories tell us that the people of the past recognized water as this gigantic agent that had the potential and the power to destroy everything. And our relationship to it was a dialectic one. And a good way of telling a story that sticks is to anthropomorphize, right? And so then you have these stories that stick all the time. And that's why, incidentally, again, back to your original question, that's why I'm writing a biography in a way, because I'm trying to, use the tools and the arguments of modern discourse, but still trying to impress on people that this is a thing that does stuff and does stuff on the landscape. And so that's where these two things come together. On the one hand, the scientific realization that the power of water is enormous and can be overwhelming, even to the most technological society in human history, no matter how rich we come. Look at California. It's struggling with water, the most powerful economy arguably on the planet, right? And at the same time, the recognition that for thousands of years we've connected we connected water and its behavior to the numinous, to the sort of ethereal and to the spiritual, because it really shapes our life like almost no other, right? And so this is reflected in all of these traditions.
Wow, I read this in your book, but kind of listening to you, these stories from you now, it's like new stories altogether. Thank you so much, for sharing.
My pleasure. Yeah.
So, as I told you, Water Studio at Ahmedabad University has, Foundation program has a water studio, and it has a very interesting module where we talk about these things. We talk about water and culture, and we also talk about the intersection it makes with, gender and caste and race, and water has, along with being a part, very integral part of our culture. Giant. It's also kind of connected with qualities, with social.
So you've gone quiet for a few seconds there. Could you repeat the question?
So what I was saying is that at the foundation program, Water Studio kind of has a very interesting module. It has 4 modules, and one of the modules, it talks about communities. It talks about the intersection water makes with gender and race and caste, and how it has a long connection, with inequalities. And while women, the stereotypical image that you see in your mind when you talk about water scarcity, there are 2 things, but one very powerful image is where you see the women, or a woman or girl children, carrying water on their heads, walking, long distance and kind of facing so many things, while this water journey, happens. Yeah. So, and in your book, or whatever that you have covered, the whole long, the transaction that happened between water and communities, did this kind of, is this something, is it a modern image that we're seeing? I know that the earlier, civilizations, societies were a little more egalitarian than, what we're seeing now a little bit, but is it a modern image, or you would see that, thousands of years ago, or probably when the sedentary societies began?
So I think that because, water, the experience of water on the landscape, to the extent that society is able to exercise collective action. So let's leave aside tribal societies that are stateless. But if we're talking about societies that have a state, then, the management of the landscape for the purposes of managing water is an act of power. And so inevitably it reflects, so the beneficiaries end up inevitably becoming those who have access to power, those who have political and powerful agency. In Rome, as an example, I'm Italian in origin, Rome never really invested enormous amounts of resources in large-scale water infrastructure, which is a so odd thing to say. People know one thing about the Romans is the aqueducts, from the Monty Python sketch, if not from the history books. But the fact of the matter is those aqueducts were mostly patronage, private patronage. They weren't an expression of state power. The way in which Rome managed its water issues, mostly agricultural water issues, how do we ensure that we have production of food, was through commerce and through building institutions that could trade grains continuously, so that if the crops failed somewhere because it didn't rain, you could get them somewhere else. And then the experience of water was entirely, using class for Rome is a little complicated, but the society was stratified. And so you could essentially tell how rich a person was by simply how far up a hill they would build their house so that they wouldn't be exposed to continuous flooding. So urbanization reflected that power, and urbanization was the principal lever to protect themselves from flooding. If you were a poor person, you lived in a condo, literally. I mean, a condominium comes from Rome, and the poorer you were, the lower you were in the floors, and you would get, occasionally. That's why we don't have a lot of sort of, small objects and personal effects from Rome, because people didn't have them, because every so often a river would come through and just wash it all out, right? And so, I don't know that we can say that these societies were any more egalitarian. I think that where we are today, though, is an interesting predicament, because we live in societies that, for the most part, are dominated by the modern state, and certainly you and I live in democratic societies that have made of the political emancipation of their citizens, the core of their purpose, right? These republics exist as res publica for the purposes of emancipating and giving political agency to everybody. Now, society has all sorts of legacy structures, but in principle, that's what you'd want to see. And so then the issues that you describe are failures of delivery, right? They're failures of society, not technical delivery. I'm not just saying the delivery of the water. They're failures of delivery of the promise, which is full citizenship in society, right? And you can see this quite clearly in the independentist movements that followed Indian independence in Africa in the 1960s and 70s. A whole generation, Julius Nyerere, Nkrumah, all these sort of Marxist African leaders who trained in England, in Manchester, and then sort of moved, post-colonial Africa and established states. They all, saw the promise of the new state, in their case, a planned economy in a socialist state, as using the power of the state to build infrastructure that would deliver the kind of economic development that would empower and emancipate people from poverty, and therefore give them some form of political agency, not liberal political agency, but political agency, right? And to the extent that they failed, and indeed they did fail. I mean, I worked a lot in Ethiopia, and many Ethiopians who live in the landscape today in a way that's not dissimilar from how they would have lived in the 14th century, don't have much political agency and don't have any water security. And many of them have the kind of life that you describe, where somebody has to walk hours and hours and hours to get to drinking water, let alone having water for food. Well, that's a failure, but it's a developmental failure, and it's a political failure. It's not just a technological failure, right? So I think that what's interesting about water is because water, the management of water is about the delivery of water security and of agricultural productivity. And that is the cornerstone of the modern state. In the 19th century, that's all it had to do, aside from sort of military engagement, right? And so where it fails, it's a failure of political institutions, which is, last thing I'll say on this is that's, I think, why it's so troubling that the modern state is now failing to manage and respond to a changing climate. Because the consequences of failure are not technical, they are political, because they translate in a redistribution of power, right? Some people will be fine. I mean, one of the most pernicious images that is out there about climate change is that it's the equivalent of an asteroid that will hit the Earth. There was Netflix had this movie called Don't Look Up that was quite successful, at least in Europe. Maybe you had it in India too. And then it uses the metaphor of an asteroid. But the metaphor is completely mistaken, because the asteroid would hit the Earth, it would kill everybody. It's a completely egalitarian thing. If the problem is an apocalypse, all we can do is repent and wait, right? The problem is that climate change doesn't result in an apocalypse, results in a massive redistribution of benefits and a massive redistribution of costs. And that's a political problem. the institutions we inhabit are designed to solve. And if they fail to solve them, then it will undermine the legitimacy of those institutions. And so I think that the mismanagement of water is not just a problem of justice, it may turn out to be a problem of freedom, in that they undermine, what is probably the most important gift of the 20th century, which is many of us enjoy, which is some degree of political agency, some degree of ability, collectively, if not individually, to author our life. And we can only author our life if we collectively have some control over what happens on the environment, and we collectively have some voice in shaping it.
To be very honest, your book is definitely changing our version. I mean, at least my version of water story for my class at the water studio.
Good.
And thank you so much. Thank you so much. I mean, I've been thinking about a lot of things, but not exactly the way you're putting it. And I think that's kind of helping me, and I'm sure it will help many others who are listening to us, some of the students of Water Studio. So thank you very much. Now, so I would call it paradise. I mean, I'm looking at the story, the whole journey. Paradise was built and paradise lost because we could not manage water, because we could not, manage mega level changes that probably water brought. So how do you think, like today, as you already, said that it's like, maybe we are kind of into kind of apocalyptic kind of changes. But how are we doing, in these times of water scarcity? I mean, do you think our paradise is already lost and probably we don't have time? In the movie, they had time and they could change things. But how are we doing? What do you think? You've seen the journey. You're kind of covering from the time whatever, existed on the planet till today. So yeah. How are we doing? What do you say? I mean, we had one of the poll questions, how concerned you are, and some of them, one person said not at all concerned. Some of them said, yes, very much concerned. Yeah. How should we be concerned?
Well, I think I am concerned. I'm also optimistic in that I don't think this is an exogenous problem. I don't think that this is something that's happening to us. I think this is something we're doing to ourselves. And so the question is how do we correct course? Everything is, all the problems we are confronting are well within our power to manage. Now, let's leave aside. Let's assume we'll stop emitting carbon dioxide at the rates that we have in the past, and I think we're not quite on track, and but presumably we're not. We're no longer on the worst possible scenario, and I suspect just economics will take care of the sort of energy sector. But we are committed to some amount of change. I mean, we are going to exceed. This is my own personal opinion. We are going to exceed 1.5 degrees. We're probably going to land somewhere between 2 and 2.5 degrees. We know that that's not. That's not, some people would say that's not catastrophic, but of course it depends, catastrophe is a personal experience. It depends on where you live and who you are. Plenty of people today have catastrophic experiences of climate, even without worrying about the 2 degrees increase. I mean, think of the 20 million people that are essentially starved right now in the Horn of Africa because of three successive crises, droughts. Mostly La Nina induced, they're incredibly vulnerable. So the experience of catastrophe is not a function of the changing climate alone, it's a function of our vulnerability. And vulnerability is the result of the investments and the choices that we make. You can drive a car and you might have an accident, but if you have a big car with an airbag and a seat belt, and you have a seat for your child, and you drive cautiously, maybe the impact won't be so bad. So I think that sometimes we look at the finger, not the moon. It's yes, the climate is changing, but that's not the asteroids inevitably hitting the Earth. Whether that becomes a catastrophic experience depends entirely on us, And so I'm worried because we're not interpreting this problem this way. We're sort of mostly having conversations about science And I'm a scientist, right? So I think it's interesting. I mean, the science is actually not that interesting because everything we need to know, we knew when I started studying climate in the 90s. So like from a climate change perspective, there's nothing we've learned. It's like there's nothing more to know. It's there's some uncertainty, but we know it's changing, and the only question is what we do about it. But I'm concerned that we seem to be debating a lot either whether to believe the science or whether somebody come up with some engineering plan to solve it, right? And the problem is that there's no solution that's independent of the people implementing it. The solution is not an abstract notion that some scientist in some country can come up with the whole world, because it has to be legitimate to stick, right? That's just a utopian dream. It's sort of like an H.G. Wells type dream that's just not going to happen. World government, we don't have it. So there's no point in describing a plan for a world government that doesn't exist. The question is, how do you get individual sovereign nations, which is the way in which we currently are organized? You could debate whether that's a good thing, but that's the reality, where the individual sovereign nations are in a position to actually manage the problem. And that means allocating power and resources to places, giving agency to people, and exercising collective action. Now, you mentioned Paradise Lost, right? Echoing Milton. Now, Milton writes Paradise Lost whilst England is in the Commonwealth, right? The great Republican experiment that didn't continue. Life would have been very different for all of us if it had, but it didn't, right? But at the time, there were these questions, that had emerged out of the Renaissance of what does self-government actually look like? Right? What does a modern republic look like? All of our countries, I'm from Italy, from India, they're both republics. 3/4 of the countries of the world call themselves republics, although many of them maybe don't exercise that notion fully. And Milton, like us, was asking this question of what is the right balance between individual liberty and collective responsibility. That's the crux of the question. In a world that at the time when he was writing that had abandoned any notion on universal power, right? The emperor was gone, the pope was gone, then they came back with the British Empire, of course, but that was temporary. So that question is still with us. What's the right balance of individual liberty and collective responsibility? That's the heart of the Republican question. The heart of the Republican question is not a plan, it's a pact, it's a compact. Right? It's a civic compact. A citizenship is not just a right, is a civic right. It comes with responsibilities, not just with rights. Yeah? And the thing that worries me, so you asked me if I'm worried. What worries me is not so much that, we're running out of time. We're not running out of time. Things might get worse. We'll just have more things to manage. The question is, at what point do you have a discussion about what it means to be a republic in a world that is changing, in a world in which the republic has to exercise collective power on behalf of the citizenship whilst the world around you is moving, right? That's a problem that modernity hasn't really addressed in over 100 years. By the way, we solved it before, right? I mean, the American Republic, in many ways, the modern model of the democratic republic was built and born out of an act of sovereignty over the landscape. And conquest, right? I mean, to be fair, but it was an act of sovereignty over the landscape, and the institutions of America were framed and built around sovereignty over the landscape, around managing the landscape. That's why, in the book, I spend a lot of time talking about the New Deal. I spend a lot of time talking about the progressive era of the United States, because in a way, that's what shaped our collective understanding of what it looks like for a republic to exercise its sovereign muscle over the landscape in service of the security of its citizens. Then we forgot about the state. We all got enamored with the markets. We sort of figured that everything could be resolved at the margins. For the last 50 years, there hasn't been really any discussion of republics, partly because most countries are republics and partly because independentist movements, aside from a few places, have sort of come and gone, right? But that, to me, is the crux of the question. Do your students understand, have a picture in their mind of what it means to be a citizen in a republic, and what responsibilities and what rights come with that, and what is the right level, in a place as complicated as India with states and union, where is the right level of power for those discussions? Where do you solve the problem of the woman who has to deal with a water pump that's a kilometer away versus the problem of producing enough grain to feed the country versus, managing some tributary of the Indus to provide electricity for industrialization. All of these are part of the Republican project of India. How is that susceptible not to management but to political oversight? And what are the words that we use for that? And the last thing I'll say on this, Septum, is that one of the indicators of whether we are on track, whether we are having that right kind of conversation, is whether nations engage in constitutional discourse around these issues. It is striking to me that many countries, America being the first, by the way, do not speak of landscape in their constitutions. This is a heritage of when constitutional projects are mostly mid-19th century projects. They emerge out of calls for freedom and in political emancipation. That was the problem then. In the 20th century, republics turned into welfare organizations, right? And the political project was around welfare, individual empowerment, and individual economic empowerment. That's why these republics became such big actors in the economy. I think now the question is, what does it look like to manage the landscape? And it's a principled conversation because, again, as I started, it's about what you see when you look out of the window. It's about the home. What does the home look like? And it's very hard to have a compact if you don't have a conversation about principles, about what do we all agree are the principles by which we would decide what our home should look like. If we accept that you can't decide independently of me, because we have to manage the landscape together to manage water. So to me, one of these questions, am I worried or not? I mean, the more I see political parties that are literate on these fundamental questions of principle, when I see activists who do not only argue for justice, but also for constitutionalism, and for the structure of the state, when I see people who don't just say follow the science, but actually engage, in what Anna Arendt used to talk about when she talked about the human condition, like authoring your life through the political processes, that's when I think we can start being optimistic. If we get distracted and think that this is just about implementing some plan that somebody cooked up, then we're not going to get there because there's not enough power behind those plans to actually make them work.
I'm so glad I asked you this question, and I actually, think that it's not just. I mean, of course, we invited water studio students. We could have invited all the foundation program studio students because we're dealing with these things. We're discussing these things as a part of our classroom discourse in our democracy and justice in our neighborhoods, in our climate, environment, and climate change studios. So I think. It's thank you so very much for kind of giving it a new perspective and broadening it. So I mean, before we move on to opening the forum for the audience, I just have one small question. You mentioned Israel. Israel appears in your book, as the earliest, societies thinking about water, and even today, Israel's approach is water-centric. It is a leader in water efficiency. So do you think this is a way forward? Of course, I know it is political. In China, making huge investments, it's political. But what is this a way forward?
Well, it's a way forward for Israel, but whether it's a way forward, I'm not a big believer in sort of universal answers. Precisely for the reason that I just described, which is I think that the answers are emergent out of a political discussion, right? And so in the case of Israel, I mean, I think two things. One is obviously that part of the world has a historic relationship with water. It's not a continuous relation. The modern state of Israel, the product of Zionism and of the sort of Theodor Herzl's dream for a modern state, has little to do with the Natufians who lived there in 8000 BCE. So whilst the experience of scarcity is the same, it's not one continuous story. But that said, I think Israel, just by necessity, has placed water at the heart of its survival, and so from a technological perspective, it's developed enormous number of solutions, and from a political perspective, it's also made some really important steps for example, in the 1960s, end of the 50s, they started building this national water carrier, Mekrot, which is, it's responsible. It's a wholesaler water. It takes water from the Sea of Galilee and then distributes it across the country, which is then distributed by the utilities. And so it's sort of replumbed the country. And then it's, most recently it's added a lot of desalination. The challenge with Israel is that Israel as a nation that confronts the issue of water management, let's leave aside the sort of politics with the Palestinian community and the Palestinian nation, but is an example of the consequences of being aware of the consequences of scarce water, right? And so they've invested in productivity, and they've done a lot of important investment in the Jordan Valley. It's very productive, et cetera, et cetera. Alas, the central question that kind of dominates the story of Israel is not the national story, but is the international story, because Israel is a country, one of many riparian countries around the Jordan, and so it's one of those examples where water has become a bargaining tool in a geopolitical situation. But even there, I should say, I mean, this question allows me to say an important thing, which we haven't touched on, which is that often another rhetoric around water is that of water wars. And I think that's and its origin is in the Arab-Israeli conflicts. But the fact of the matter is that that's largely a lie. Not the conflicts, but the fact that water will lead to wars. Because first of all, lots of things lead to wars. The idea that wars are the result of only one thing is kind of just a misunderstanding of how the world works. Obviously the Arab-Israeli conflict has a lot to do with the legacy of British colonialism there, and the establishment of a state, and the politics and geopolitics of the region, the pan-Arabism of Nasser. I mean, the list is long as to why there ought to be conflict there. And of course, yes, it's true that water played a role in the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, because there was an attempt to cut off Israel at some part of the supply in Syria and the Golden Heights, and et cetera, right? But it's also true that even through that, water was also an instrument of diplomacy. And there were attempts at sharing the Nile waters. Sadat tried to share the waters of the Nile as part of the accords that led to Camp David, to try and figure out a solution, a non-zero-sum solution between the different parties, right? And to me, it's important to realize that, again, even in an international domain, water drags us in the political far more than it drags us into the military or the engineering. Water is far more often a route to diplomacy than it is a route to conflict. I mean, even the experience of India and Pakistan, which I talk about in the book, with all the problems and all the complexities and all the complexities right now in Kashmir, of course, even so, the Indus Waters Treaty has withstood, largely the test of time, with all sorts of problems, but it's a testament of how even countries that have a number of difficulties in the international arena can still cooperate on the management of an international water body. And that, to me, again speaks to the political nature. Water is not about water, it's about people. That's fundamentally the message. Israel is an interesting story, but again, it becomes a universal story only if you think that the problem of water is a technology problem, right? Where drip irrigation is the answer to the agricultural issue. And again, we may all end up using drip irrigation, but that's not where the problem is. The problem is inherently political and about power and the allocation of resources.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. But I think I'd have to share my time with all the others. And so let's have some questions from the audience.
Yeah, so we have a lot of questions. So I would like to invite Dr. C. Muthraj to ask his questions on camera. If you can unmute yourself. Yes.
Hello.
Yeah, you're audible.
Good evening to all. Really, I enjoyed the powerful presentation. Thanks for your valuable presentation. It's more of interdisciplinary, more of a holistic understanding, really touching all the disciplines linked with water. At the same time, I have few clarifications, not as a question. Number one, about water crimes at the home level, water crimes at the firm level, water crimes at the farming level. That means because of scarcity, because of governance, because of some other reasons, we are able to evidence water crimes. Can we think of minimizing water crimes by way of suggesting some policy which is more applicable to rural India? It's only a request to the speaker. Second one, today I think your presentation made all the answers for hypothetical questions, which many of us have a questions. Your presentation made all the answers for the questions. The second question is regarding water governance. Today, people are saying technology will help to govern the water in a proper way to bring water efficiency. Do you have any idea of digital technology, or through digitalization we can try to improve the water governance in Indian context or Asian context by way of minimizing inefficiency, minimizing water crime, minimizing scarcity of water and all that? So through digital governance, either water mapping or water allocation, all that. So whether digital technology will help us to govern the water in a proper way. Thanks for your listening. I think we enjoyed a lot. It's more of reading more than a dozen books. That speaks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. All very great questions, and I'm always very hesitant to provide sort of prescriptive answers to things that I'm, not a citizen on, and sort of not entirely directly involved. But I guess two observations. One is, on the water crimes issue, in the end, a lot of this has to do with the enforcement of property rights and the definition of property rights of land and of resources, right? Because the policing happens on top of that, right? So, and there, the reality is that it's not easy. I mean, even Italy just had a massive drought. It's in main river. We obviously have much smaller rivers than India does, but nevertheless, we have a big river called the Po River. It went completely dry, and some of that has to do with the misallocation of water, which was the result actually of misappropriation. So people that would just draw water they had no right to draw. Now, you would imagine that perfect transparency would lead you to a greater ability to police, and technology might indeed play a role in that. But as you know, greater transparency also creates greater power. And so then the question becomes whether you have enough oversight over the application of technology that those who don't have power don't suffer additional costs in the process. So I think that you focus on governance. And I think that's the key architecture that needs to be getting right. So it's how do you govern the water, and how do you govern the instruments that allow you to know what's going on in the water system? Once you have that, then you don't necessarily need enormously sophisticated technology to solve the problem. For example, there's a very famous, you'll have heard of Elinor Ostrom, the famous economist, Nobel Prize winner, who developed the theory of the commons. And she was inspired by a little village in Switzerland called Turbel in Switzerland, where since 1200 people have been managing a integrated communal system of water sharing that's based on timing. And nobody manages the system, nobody's planned it, but everybody in the system knows that at some point during the day when the sun hits a particular peak, they have right to water, so they move a little piece of wood from one canal to another. They let the water through, and the water comes to their little patch of land. An hour later, when the sun's gotten to another peak, they'll move the thing back. And this thing's been going on since the 1200s. It's not particularly technologically complicated, but the communal governance that is established in that village makes it work. So to me, technology can be helpful. I think the definition of property rights can be helpful. In the end, the crux of the matter is the political agency of the participants in the system. That's where this thing kind of starts. And there is a bit of a risk, I think technology has a role to play, but we live, as you probably know, in a renaissance of Earth monitoring, right? I mean, one of my activities is to monitor biomass from space, so I can tell what's using water by looking at trees grow. So I can do that from thousands of kilometers above the planet. But that technology is only going to result in just and efficient outcomes if the underlying governance works. So that to me is the crux of the issue.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your new interpretation. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for the question.
Thanks. Now I would like to invite Professor Vivek Tanawade to ask his question.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you, Sudhir.
Hello.
Excellent talk. Very interesting. I'm a professor of biology and I teach in the water studio as well. A question. I mean, usually I make this as a statement to my students, but today I'm posing this as a question to you because I don't know the answer. The statement that I make is that you touched upon rivers, and in many cultures, including our own culture, we worship rivers as goddesses, as mothers, but yet we have no hesitation in polluting the same rivers that we worship for our economical gains. Now, assuming that a society, we are part of the same society, we are the society that does both these things. Now, and assuming that we have equal political capital, let's say it's not one or the other, one lobby is not stronger than the other, how do you think then we would exercise this decision or right in terms of balancing the requirement of an economical gain versus sustainability?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that's why I was talking to Saptam about constitutional compacts, because it's remarkable how these questions ultimately, bubble up all the way to very fundamental first principles about what do we care about? Why is the Yamuna River so polluted? It's a kind of interesting question given the importance of these places for American culture, for Indian culture. Why is the Po River polluted? The Tiber, the great river god that supported Rome, and I suppose there's a couple of things here. One is there's a lag. Our values evolve over time, right? And they evolve in part because of the transparency. Back to the previous question of what's actually happening in the system, right? We know about ecological processes and ecological condition today in ways that we didn't know maybe 50, 60 years ago. But then the second issue is that arguably in the first half of the 20th century, when the model, the modernist model was set, that then became the dominant model around the world of using the landscape and the rivers of the world to support economic development. If you had a constitutional reform process at that time, you probably would have enshrined, and in fact you did in the constitutions like the Spanish Constitution that emerged in the 1930s, or the sort of constitutions of the first part of the 20th century, enshrined the right to work, the right to, but not the right to health, for example. They enshrined the right to self-fulfillment and self-determination, but not the right to a healthy environment, right? And so I think the tension that you observe is the tension between values that haven't been enshrined in the architecture of our institutions, 50 years ago, and the emergent values that are arising out of the kind of current awareness of the environmental sustainability problem. And the test for the true universality and legitimacy of those concerns about pollution is that they do in fact transform the constitutional architecture, right? Because otherwise the risk is we've had these things before. In the United States, the environmental movement started in the 60s with a woman called Rachel Carson. She wrote a book called, she was actually a biologist, right? So Silent Spring was all about the effects of pollution, of the chemical industry primarily, problem of DDT, DET, and the likes. But the fact of the matter is that very little changed. People got richer. They, offshored some of that production. Some wealthy people started worrying about this, and some legislative change happened. So out of that, in the Nixon administration, so we're now in the 70s, America passed the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, which were the legislative instruments that prevented some of that pollution from happening, and some of these rivers got cleaned up. I would note, by the way, that the most recent conservative administrations in the US have started dismantling some of that legislative infrastructure, partly because it never made it up to a constitutional discussion, right? It was never the environmental movement never succeeded in lifting the debate out of immediate politics into a civic conversation about what we ought to be doing. And so that's why we end up holding these tensions. And I think the challenge for all of us who might care about these issues is to make the case to our fellow citizens, not just to care, but to lift these things up to the level of principles. You know, in a way, if you like, the power of religious conviction and of the numinous is that it sort of becomes by design a principled conversation, right? I think that's why we end up worshiping these things. But we all live in republics, and so to translate those into civic behavior, we have to somehow turn these things into constitutional discussions.
Yeah, excellent point. And so essentially, environmental movement needs to become much more mainstream.
Exactly.
In the discourse of the society, rather than being on the fringes as it has been.
Yeah, I worry a lot about the fact that the environmental discourse in many countries, including Italy, including the UK, possibly including India, ends up being subsumed in a somewhat old-fashioned and naive critique of capitalism, and ends up staying at the fringes. Whereas, in fact, the question is, you know, it is striking to me that everybody talks about the economy and nobody talks about the political architecture that we live under, because that's where the lever stands. That's where you enroll everybody in a project that changes the face of your home, not in, you know, who owns the means of production. That's not going to change the environmental outcome necessarily. And so I think you're exactly right. And it is not a coincidence, I think, that almost no country has a mainstream environmental political party. That the fact is, environment is a flavor that's sprinkled on other theories of the state, but it doesn't have its own theory of the state. And I think that's a problem.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Julio.
Yeah, pleasure.
Yeah, now I would like to invite one of our students, Laksh. Laksh, if you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello. Hello,
Hi.
sir. It's like I enjoyed the lecture. I have only one question. Like I have also discussed it with Saptam ma'am during the foundation program. I'm a fresher in the university. So, sir, like always we have considered water, like water problems can only be solved by individual efforts, and individual efforts are only thing like individual efforts are based on what scarcity are they having. Like for example, in my case, sir, I don't have that much scarcity as compared to the person who is living in like in the village side of my area. So like, sir, is that water problems, is that water opportunity, or what, like the water problems that create that are being created in our community are being created by us, like the people who have the majority of the water, or all the people are responsible? Because the steps are not being taken by like the majority the people who are receiving the majority of the water, but the steps are being taken by the people who already have the scarcity. So like does these monetary connections like that of like I have the monetary power, and if I have the monetary power I would enjoy using water, but but the person who does not have that monetary power will won't be able to enjoy the water benefits. So sir, does this problem arises because of because of that monetary power or something else? Because we blame politics.
Yeah, well, so it's an important question, and in a way, it speaks to what we were saying earlier. So, if you believe that the role of the individual is that of a consumer, and I pay, I get water, and it's so the subsidiarity is essentially down to the individual. You know, it's a function, your access to water, or your access to water security, which is not just about the supply of water, but it's also about not having your home flooded, is about individual means and the likes. Then, you know, if you have this narrow sort of economic view in which everything is sort of down to the market, then you end up in exactly where you say that, you know, some people can afford it and they'll have water, and the people that don't. And, you know, arguably, worldwide, that's exactly what happens. Rich people have water. You know, even in the depths of the deepest drought in California, if you will live in Los Angeles, you still take a shower. But, you know, in Ethiopia, you know, you simply don't have, you know, not only you don't have water, you don't even have a tap. So in the grand scheme of things, that's actually how it plays out. But we have these things called nation states and political institutions through which we try to rebalance these things. And water ends up being a prominent example where the narrow view of I pay, I get simply doesn't work, because actually that's not how even the economics of water works. So, for example, utilities are systems of mutualization. If you live on a hill in Mumbai, it costs more money to get water up to your hill than at the coast, simply because water is heavy and you need to lift it, right? But typically utilities have water tariffs that are based on various parameters, but they're not based on geography necessarily. And so even in that simple example, there is some form of mutualization. Everybody pays a water tariff, and, actually some people are implicitly subsidizing somebody else. So in an urban setting, that already happens. The issue is that it doesn't involve everybody. So often there'll be informal settlements that don't have access to those water services. One of the biggest risks that we have is that instead of recognizing that the utility model, which is primarily a public health intervention, right? We want clean water so that we don't get cholera across cities. We don't want clean water because people pay. The payment is simply a way of making it happen. But the purpose is not making money, obviously, is avoiding public health issues, right? The utility model is actually a mutual political model where different people pay the same amount of money, regardless of how much they earn, in order to get everybody access to water. Typically, the state has to underwrite some of it, partly because they have to provide the land on which you build the water treatment works, partly because it typically costs more than what you pay in order to provide you the water, right? The biggest risk is that we go down a route that says everything is distributed and individualized. So if you live in a big high-rise that can have a water treatment works in its basement, then I have clean water. But that means I just pay for that. I don't have to pay for the treatment works that are centralized. Now, you could generalize this problem to the whole country, because you could say, in order for an entire city not to be flooded, you probably need to manage the river upstream. So you need to do something to the landscape of those who live in the rural area somewhere upstream of you. And so you need some of the how to mutualize that problem, right? The people downstream have to pay something for the people upstream to actually modify their landscape so that there's a levee or something that contains the water that would actually come downstream. And you build it up, and soon enough you'll realize that this is just general taxation. The role of the state is actually to pool resources in order to spend money into managing the landscape. And so to me, water is a perfect example of why we can't actually manage it the way you were describing. You can't actually deal with it simply by having those who can pay for it and get it, and those who can't don't get it. And the reason is that I'll say this last thing, Lakshya, which is that, it would be easy to fall into that trap if the only problem in water we faced was supply of water to drink. Because that's not a lot of water, first of all, right? I mean, actually drinking water is a tiny problem in the water space. It's most of the water we need is for agriculture, not for drinking. And in truth, Dubai exists. If you have enough money, you can create water out of literally thin air, right? And so in that sense, fine. But the problem is water security is not just about drinking water. It's also about having enough food. And it's also about avoiding floods. Water, remember when we started, water is this massive giant that operates at scales that transcend individual. The size of the monsoon is not the size of an individual. No individual can manage the water comes down from the monsoon. If you want to manage the monsoon, you have to catch that water somewhere. And if you have to catch that water somewhere, it means that you have to use somebody's land to catch it, right? And so suddenly you're in a political debate in which you at least have two parties, if not more, that have to somehow negotiate. And this is true over and over again for all of the water phenomena that we deal with. And so just for the nature of the problem that we have, which is not just water supply at home, it's the management of the delivery of water security. Now, just for that reason, it is essentially unsolvable if you don't have a way of mutualizing it. And the modern state is the way in which we've decided to mutualize these kind of problems. It's a bit like policing, right? I mean, yeah, there are countries where people have hired their own police, but those are countries you probably don't want to live in. You know what I mean? Like, I think that a successful state is a state that can extend security to its citizens. That's the fundamental function of the modern state. And it so happens that part of that security is water security. And so the answer has to be political, and no amount of money is going to solve any individual's water security problem, because you can't buy it. It's a, it's an act of sovereignty that transcends economic power,
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Laksha, for asking this. Our time was till 5:30 and we are up. If you would like to take a couple of more questions, otherwise.
Yeah, we can do a couple of questions.
Okay. So now I would like to invite Professor Supratim Das Gupta. He has a similar question. I think partly you've answered, but if you would like to add something. Professor Supratim, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, hello. So it was a very engrossing conversation. So I actually had, so I'm a professor of economics. I was trying to make an assignment, but I was so engrossed in the conversation. It was like a blockbuster, like a film that you just cannot leave. I mean, every word was so engrossing because you gave such an interdisciplinary picture. So the question I had was kind of connected to the previous question, was about water wastage. So, that you have said that taxation. So my question actually was, how do you sociologically and from a historical perspective defend or not defend a water tax? I'm not talking from an economics perspective. So what is a citizen's right or what is a citizen's attitude to a water tax? That was one question. And the question which is kind of, connected to it, related to it, is that based on your answer is in India, we don't have a water tax. We don't have an equal water tax, and we actually have free municipal supply of water through certain faucets in the city I come from, which is Kolkata. So we have free municipal taps where a lot of socio-economically poor people get their water from, and you see enormous amount of wastage of that, enormous amount. So when the water comes, when there's high tide, there is a lot of water, but that is just not stored. That is for ablution, and that's just wasted. So how do you kind of reconcile these two issues?
Yeah. Well, you say it's not just from an economic perspective, but let's just talk about the economic perspective for a second before we sort of generalize it. Because water is, of course, incredibly complicated and fascinating in all sorts of complicated ways, right? So it's a private good, and it can be sort of competable and all that stuff, but it's also public good, it's also common good. So there are all these attributes that make it difficult to regulate and assign property rights and sort of manage in traditional economic forms. And so you end up having always these blends of instruments. Because, for example, let me take the example of New York City as a counterpoint to your example, right? So New York City is the system, equivalent system, the municipal system of New York City is owned by the municipality. So it's entirely publicly owned. And you do pay a tariff, but the tariff is not volumetric. It's essentially a tax, right? So it's not related to, and you could say, well, that leads to enormous inefficiency, which is sort of true in the sense that the marginal productivity of water is irrelevant to the choices that people make in using it. But it doesn't matter, because the thing is that water is collected in the Catskills, which is about 200 kilometers out of New York, in these vast forested watersheds. And it's then drawn down by gravity to New York City through these large aqueducts that were built in the 1920s. And then the head of water, the pressure, is sufficiently high that you don't even need to add energy to pump it all the way up to the 6th floor. Only when you get to the 6th floor that you have to actually pump it. And furthermore, the water is quite clean. So it turns out that because it's sourced so far from the city, and because the area is forested, the quality of the water is very high. And so it only goes through what's called tertiary treatment, meaning you disinfect it just to ensure that there's no bacteria. But you don't have to go through primary and secondary treatment. So you have to go through a vast water treatment plant, which typically has some operating costs. Now, all of that infrastructure costs a lot of money to build. So the total cost of the water is high, but the marginal cost of water is zero, because once you've built it, it costs nothing to deliver it, right? And so the total cost was built through general taxation by the municipality of New York. And New York is a rich city, raises a lot of taxes and has a lot of businesses, and then just pays for this water. In fact, New York City bought the land around these reservoirs just to make sure that nobody would build anything on it, right? And that raises a whole other set of distributional issues with the folks that live in the rural area who live there and, you know, can't even build an airport because, you know, New York City doesn't want anything to fall into its water. But then once that's built, which is a, you know, it's a sort of average infrastructure, an infrastructure problem, then the delivery is highly inefficient, but it doesn't matter because actually there's no, you know, you waste water, but water just goes back into the aquifer, you know, so you may say that you're marginally wasting the capital, but, you know, that's sort of sunk cost and it was done by the public sector. And in any case, interestingly, as you probably well know, public institutions don't project finance anything. They all budget finance things. So once you've built it, you know, you go to the next year's budget and you're done. You know, it's in the past. There's no shadow balance sheet for public institutions, which is one of the great sort of, you know, mysteries of economic management, I think. So now back to your question, there is this tension, but I think we always have to remember that efficiency is never really the objective of water management. Productivity is, and it should be productivity writ large. And so I would put into that the good functioning of the economic and social system. So even if you have, you know, poor people who have access to water, they don't pay a tax, they waste water as a result, although arguably they probably waste less than other businesses do, you know. If the end result is a population that can go to work and go to school because they don't have to worry about where the water is going to come from, it's likely that the integrated result, if you were to do a secondary effects analysis of what the full impact of that, even if there is an efficiency in the use, you know, in the exchange, it's probably quite an efficient use of public resources. And so to me, one of the issues here is that, again, the framing of water as energy is often mistaken because most of the value of energy is in the electron or in the molecule of oil. But most of the value of water is not in the molecule of water. Most of the value of water is in the infrastructure that gives access to it. And that may or may not be best paid for, and its efficiency may not be best measured through marginal exchanges. And so, you know, so putting that lens of efficiency to those taxations and payments is sort of it's, you know, in a way, it's a red herring. Now, there's a completely different question if you're talking about, you know, use of agricultural water. You know, vast amounts of public infrastructure being used, let's say in the western United States. Water costs a lot to actually get it to the farm, and then the farm grows alfalfa, which is a incredibly valueless commodity whose value wouldn't cover the cost, the public cost of the delivery. So you're actually destroying value in the process, right? So that's a completely economically inefficient use of water. It's justified on political grounds. Having farmers sit there and happy is a politically valuable thing to have, but it's economically completely inefficient. So I'm not answering your question, I realize that, but I suppose that in the case of water, I think efficiency is a tricky analysis because of all these different attributes. And actually the really interesting question is if you place the ring, the economic sort of fence way wider around water, and you include a bunch of secondary effects, even localized, then the calculus of what's productive changes quite dramatically. And the role of taxation in that, you know, is one of the various items that gets used to pay for the thing, but actually you'll discover most of the payment is the public purse, you know, in the act of building the infrastructure. I'll say one last thing, and then I'll shut up and on this. But, you know, one of the interesting things about this discussion that we're just having is that the economics profession writ large, and, you know, I'm not talking about you, I don't know your work, but it's interesting that you read the top 3 or 4 economics journals in the profession, never talk about land or water. And in fact, Oxford Policy Review, Economic Policy Review, put out a special issue on the future of the economy, and land wasn't even mentioned, let alone water. You know, there
is a journal called Land Economics, by the way.
There is. Now, interestingly, so if you said, but then if I go to the treasuries of the world and ask how many land economists work in the planning teams of the treasuries, 0 is the answer, right? And so we sort of lost this ability to ask fundamental questions, and particularly ex post ask econometric questions about the productivity and the political value of infrastructural investments that we made in the past. So Calcutta, water system, what is the economic impact of having it today, having had it for some time? What is the economic impact of the inefficiency of its use, right? Those are questions that are not limited to the efficiency of the exchange, the economic development question about the impacts on the city, right? And I've found, at least in the last 15, 20 years since I've sort of been thinking about these things, very little interest on the part of a lot of economists that have a voice with economic and political planners to look at these questions.
Yeah, I think my only quick answer to what you're saying, or quick a response would be, I think two things: that you have to understand for what water is being used for, and how much would it be used and for how long. And so that is, I think, one of the main facets, because like as you said, you cannot really efficiently allocate water. I mean, whatever be the mechanism, if it's too decentralized, because then at the margin there is really no no efficiency gain or the efficiency loss, because it is just a sunk cost. Anyway.
Yeah. And, the interesting thing is that, as I talk a little bit about this in the book, but, there's this, the way in which, like, if you look at the countries that sort of at some point start, take Ghana, or take, Ethiopia circa 1960s, or Nyerere in Tanzania, you get independent, you have to sort of decide to build a country and industrialize. What do you do? The first thing you do, this is the age of, Harold Domar is the dominant developmental framework, Arthur Lewis, these are the people that sort of framed the economic thinking of these countries. And it's all about, state-directed investment in large-scale water infrastructure to essentially move labor from increase productivity of labor from agriculture and move it into industry. And now, we've come up in the subsequent 60 years with all sorts of reasons why that thinking was wrong or not quite right, and this and that. But the fact of the matter is, we're still stuck there, in terms of thinking about the role of water in broader developmental policy. And so I think, if I were a young economist now, I would get thinking about these issues. I think that's the frontier, because we're going to find ourselves with all this moving water around us. It suddenly does things that we weren't expecting. We'll need the state to make decisions, and we don't have the sort of economic engineering to have better choices now than we did 60, 70 years ago.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I would like to invite Shruti, one of our students, to ask a quick question, because our time is up. Shruti, if you can quickly.
Yes. Happy evening, sir. Thank you so much for shifting our perspective to a broader level on how we perceive water and the issues around it. I'm really curious to know your approach that you used while researching for your book.
You are on mute.
Yeah, I found it now. I was like Marx, sitting in the British Library, poring over volumes and volumes and volumes, is the sort of closest image I can give you. It's interesting. Seriously, when you're trying to write a book that's issue-led rather than discipline-led, suddenly you find yourself having to draw on all sorts of disciplines. As you can probably tell, I'm a voracious reader, and I'm a big fan of ideas, right? And ideas live in all sorts of disciplines and cross-contaminate. One of the reasons I left academia some 20 years ago was because modern academia, unlike what you guys are trying to do with your studios, allows the disciplinary boundaries of the profession to stifle the imagination. And I think that the problems that we face today are, not just interdisciplinary sounds very sort of fashionable, but there's something profound about the fact that we have to start with the problems we're trying to solve, not with the knowledge we've accumulated. And if we start with the problem we're trying to solve and then work our way back into what do we need to know in order to understand this problem, and then maybe make a contribution, suddenly we find ourselves in a territory that frankly was the territory of every intellectual before the professionalization of academia, which was, you have to look at human knowledge, and you have to look at, it's a humanist view, right? And I think it's an important place to start, particularly if you're dealing with water. And so my approach was very curiosity driven, you know. And then once I decided that the best framing to reveal this genetic material, this kind of institutional and infrastructural scars in the landscape and in our cultures that have shaped our relationship with water for 10,000 years. And once I decided to anchor everything on a chronology, which is how you kind of can try and make sense of all of this material, then it was a matter of working my way through a bit like a detective and trying to find the strands of this story through the material. It's shining a light on a story that's there. You just have to extract it from the different pieces. And I suppose the last thing I'll say in this is, in the process, I've really come to appreciate the power and the importance of a broad education. I was blessed. Italy still has, when I studied as a student, when I was your age in Italy and I did my degree in Italy, it was still the case that you could be a physicist like myself, but also appreciate, Latin comedy. That's important. I think there's a value to that. And particularly for the big problems that we have ahead of us, I think we cannot avoid embracing the whole of human potential in order to solve them.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Professor Saptam Patel for closing remarks.
Okay, thank you so much, Julio. Thank you so much for being here, for agreeing to be a part of this conversation series and talking about your book and water. The session was riveting, extremely enriching, and I'm sure it has, the way you talk about water shaping the societies, it has shaped the perspective on water for many of us, and of course it's going to help us in whatever that we do later on. So thank you so very much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure to have this conversation.
Thank you so much for giving extra time. You're so generous. So
my
sorry
pleasure
to bother you beyond 5:30.
No worries.
Thanks a lot, and you're sharing your ideas which actually match with what we do. So we're very happy that we are doing something in the right direction. Thanks a lot, and
thank you. Thank you so
much.
much.
Thank you everyone for joining us today on Saturday afternoon, and see you soon.